Okay, so I have started the recording. Welcome to the 2024 Quaker Theological Discussion Group panels. We'll be having four presenters today. We'll be introducing each of them in turn as they give their presentation. But wanted to introduce myself. My name is Christy Randazzo. I am one of the co-chairs of the Quaker Theological Discussion Group, along with Charisse Bach, who is also a chair of the Quaker Theological Discussion Group. Every year I feel like we have to recognize we did not choose this name. We haven't inherited it. So we kind of appreciate how goofy and difficult and academic it sounds, because that's kind of who we are as a group of folks who want to talk about Quaker theology and where it is today. So the presenters we're going to have for today are Welling Hall, Lisa Graustein, Stuart Smith, and Jim Fussell. And we're going to start off with Welling, who's going to be giving our first paper. But first, I want us to take just a little bit of time for waiting worship to settle in before we get going. So let's, settle in. All right, thank you, friends. All right, Welling Hall is going to be presenting a presentation called Economies Imagined in the Work of Havel, Bolding, and Brueggemann. Um, Welling taught international relations and peace studies at Earlham from 1987 to 2018. She tried unsuccessfully to retire and then answered a call to ministry. She just completed a Master's of Divinity at Boston University School of Theology. Awesome. Congrats, Welling. That's amazing. Um, Welling is thrilled to have joined our group. Okay, so take it away.
Very, very true. And for one more word of context, I am currently doing a unit of clinical pastoral education in New Hampshire and living in a hospital room. And so this presentation could, in some ways, not be any further away from my current life. I jumped at the chance to participate again because I've had such a blast working with both Christy and Charisse. So thank you. So here is my presentation. Um, economic, is it working? Everybody seeing okay? Economic Imagination in the Theological Work of Kenneth Boulding, Václav Havel, and Walter Brueggemann. And I want to say first some contextual things about a social science idea called constructivism and the imagination, because imagination is what really drew me to this panel and this presentation, because imagination is something that until recently both social scientists and theologians have kind of been loath to talk about. And so here are some words of context. I would consider myself to be a constructivist rather than a materialist, and I'll say something about what that means. Constructivism is the social science um, method or way of thinking about the world that is also of interest to theologians. And the basic concept is that the social world is made of ideas. The social world is made up more of ideas than it is of, say, brute force. And some examples of the world being made of ideas are that some pieces of paper have more value than other pieces of paper, particularly pieces of paper that have symbols of money printed on them. Gender is something other than biology, is an idea and something that helps to construct the world. the realization that wars are fought over tenets of faith is another way of thinking about the importance of ideas in the world. And for me, two examples, huge examples, examples so significant that they are the reason I no longer consider myself a political scientist, I'll put it that way. That examples of ideas being as significant as brute force in changing material reality are what happened in 1987 when Mikhail Gorbachev said, you know, the Cold War is really a stupid idea. Let's not do that anymore. Kind of changed the world. And in 2016, when the past and now future president of the United States said, you know, the rule of law really doesn't matter and norms don't matter. Let's kind of get rid of this idea that the president is not above the law. Those are both ideas that really pretty significantly changed the world. Okay, so another thing I want to comment on briefly is, so what is imagination? And typically, the idea of imagination has been viewed suspiciously in both economics and theology because imagination is somehow supposed to be the opposite of what is real. That there are things that are real and there are things that are imagined, and never the twain shall meet. And I've been particularly glad to encounter the work of a Quaker theologian who is not with us today, Khalid Keith Perry, who's written a lot about imagination. And Khalid has been particularly helpful to me in talking about imagination as the human capacity to bring into consciousness things that are not currently present with us. And so that's one kind of way that theologians are starting to work with the concept of imagination. Another place in which theologians are working with the idea of imagination is John O'Donohue, a former Catholic priest, philosopher, Irish poet, who has many things to say about imagination, but I really appreciated encountering his work in one of his writings called The Eternal Embrace of Beauty, in which he talks about imagination as the heart of all that is holy, because imagination draws us to the edges of possibilities, and being drawn to the edges of possibilities makes it possible for us to think about possibility. And it is only when we think about possibility that we are able to conceive of engaging with the world differently. And then there are a whole lot of feminist theologians, Sally McFaig, Sandra Schneiders, who talk about the testimonial power of imagination to change the world. And I wanted to nod to them as well. So, as I said to Charisse and Christy at one point, so the premise of this paper is what happens when an economist, a playwright, and a theologian walk onto a panel. And the three that I want to say a couple of words about today are Kenneth Boulding, Václav Havel, Walter Brueggemann. And so why these three? Why did these three matter to the Quaker Theological Discussion Group? So the first of these, on the far left, I've got a picture of Kenneth Boulding, who is a noted Quaker economist, nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize in both economics and also in peace. He did some very groundbreaking work in ecological economics, general systems theories, conflict resolution, did economic thinking that bridged multiple disciplines. And I thought that a Quaker discussion panel devoted to economics might at least nod to his contributions. Václav Havel, another contender for the Peace Prize, was a Czech playwright who fell sideways into political theory as an intellectual interested in human rights and freedoms at the time when those were not tolerated in Central Europe. As the son of bourgeois parents, he was denied access to an education, but managed to get into theater through work initially as a stagehand and then rose to prominence during the Prague Spring in 1968. He served 4 years in prison for writing the essay, which is the focus of my comments today, an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And I also want to say about Havel that although he never sought office, he was elected president of Czechoslovakia by the country's parliament. His writings about how to create a better human life in the context of oppression are all about the human spirit and the spirit of something that is greater than individual human beings. In other words, his writings feel pneumatological to me, and because they speak implicitly about the role of imagination in creating a better world, they belong here. And then finally, Walter, whoops. I've got one of those darn Zoom annotation things that's blocking my ability to get back to the previous screen. It's not allowing me to reverse. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, so Walter Brueggemann is the only one of these three thinkers who's still alive. Like Boulding and Havel, he is enormously prolific and probably the most influential academic writing about the Hebrew Bible today. He's published more than 58 books about the Psalms, Sabbath as resistance to dominant culture, and what he calls the prophetic imagination, in contrast to what he has variously called the royal imagination or the dominant imagination. Okay. So, what can I tell you about Kenneth Boulding's economic imagination as it relates to theology? Boulding was really known for his witticisms, his kind of one-liners that anything that exists is possible. This was regularly cited in peace studies events to rebut disparagements that peace was not possible, especially in Cold War contexts. Boulding was a classic liberal economist and a Quaker, I would say, whose mystical voice predominated over his social justice voice. Did he have theological work? Well, his early work on God is Love was written during World War II and delivered at Arch Street Meeting House and then reprinted as a Pendle Hill pamphlet after his death in 1993, really contains a very little inclination towards social justice beyond his statement that the greatest economic principle had to be that all men should wish to act in the general welfare and not in their own particular interest. And this he regarded as being an extension of the love of God. He wrote, "The purpose of our growth in life is to bring us into unity with the universe into which we are born, to make us aware that we are not lonely individual meteors hurtling blindly through an abysmal dark, but living parts of a living whole." I'm surprised that in his economic work, he kind of wholeheartedly embraces the kind of moral development theory that has since been refuted by feminist scholars, namely that a higher, better ethics is one that takes in a larger frame of reference rather than individual care. His general argument is that economics teaches that people will value what is scarce and therefore best. Other than that, Boulding was kind of hard-pressed, I would say, to explain the relationship between his economic mindset and his theology, although it may be best illustrated by one of his most impactful essays, The Economics of Coming Spaceship Earth, written in 1966, in which he contrasted metaphors of the cowboy and the spaceman to illustrate his argument that economic thinking needs to radically reorient itself toward thinking about natural resources as finite and ecological systems that are interconnected. At the same time, he was very suspicious of egalitarianism. He suspects that the only way a society could be truly egalitarian would be by sinking to the lowest common denominator. And his theology is oriented toward the idea of a love of God in which God is greater, better, bigger than any other object of love. A theology that has hierarchy at its center. And he continues to insist that theology and economics have very little to do with each other. So I looked for and I started doing a search for an image of a cowboy and a spaceman, just kind of provide an illustration of Bolding's metaphors. And this is what I came up with. Probably not fair to Bolding, but it is an image of a cowboy and a spaceman together. Okay, Václav Havel. Václav Havel, as I mentioned, is a playwright, barely writes about economics or spirituality, although deeply implicit in his political writings. After his death, his sister Angelica said about his leadership that he wanted us to rise above the material world, to focus on other people and relationships between them. The quote on the slide is the last sentence of his influential essay, The Power of the Powerless, which was, as he said, an examination of the nature of power in the circumstances in which people operate. Power that operates as a secularized religion or a Byzantine theocracy, in which the highest secular authority is identical with the highest spiritual authority. In his essay, The Power of the Powerless, Havel uses the example of a grocery store owner mindlessly putting a party slogan poster in his shop window as an illustration of the challenges of the image he uses repeatedly of living within a lie. Havel is consistently trying to figure out how the lie is maintained and how we may live outside of the lie. So the shopkeeper putting this sign in the window that essentially means, I, the greengrocer John Doe, live here and I know what I must do. I behave in the manner expected of me. I can be depended upon and am beyond reproach. I'm obedient and therefore I have the right to be left in peace. This party slogan is a shield that protects the greengrocer from his superiors, from authorities, from informers. It is, in other words, a demonstration of living within a lie, within the spirit of death, what Havel calls the spirit of death, rather than the spirit of truth, rather than living within the truth, which is consistent with the aims of life to grow and change and evolve and nurture community. Havel says that life moves toward plurality, diversity, independent self-construction, the fulfillment of freedom, whereas what he calls the post-totalitarian system, and he includes a warning for contemporary Western technological consumerist societies. Those societies live a lie within a mendacious system, he says, that demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. He talks about functioning within the lie requiring total obedience, and he has a great deal to say about spirit, that there is something within the human person that knows truth, but life in obedience demands alienating ourselves from truth about life. But, he says, if allowed the tiniest window to grow, the spirit of truth will take root, and will take root in a way that challenges the lie. He talks about the demand to live within the lie causing a personal alienation in which individuals are divided against themselves. And because people are divided against themselves, they both long to be connected to what he calls the hidden sphere of life and are simultaneously separated from it. And because of this alienation, Havel argues that what appears to be a better economic system cannot, in fact, create a better life for human beings. He says there's no way around it, no matter how beautiful an alternative political or economic model may be, it can no longer speak to the human sphere. And if a better economic and political model is to be created, it has to derive from this profound existential need to be able to connect to the human sphere. A better system, he says, will not ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life, a life linked to imagining and bringing the hidden sphere to light, can a better system be developed.
I hate to do this, Welling, but we've reached time.
Oh my God, I'm shocked. I'm shocked. Okay, well, I'm just going to say, can I say, just show the slide about Brueggemann?
Please do.
Okay, so Brueggemann's primary way of contrasting what is with what might be is to say that what's happened in religious life is that religious life has embraced a dominant, a royal theology that insists that the present way is the only way, and that in contrast to living within the royal imagination, he calls people of faith to live within the prophetic imagination. And one way of living within the prophetic imagination is by basically embracing the idea of Sabbath as a way to build community. And I put up this money image of the pyramid because he says that how shocking it is that people are willing to live under the demands, not unlike the demands of Pharaoh, who insists that people make bricks all day long and die under the pressure of making bricks rather than um, uh, embracing what Havel would call the importance of living within the truth. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you, Christy, for the warning.
Absolutely. And thank you for that very much. Um, and I said that if we had like a really burning question, we would have maybe one question between presenters. And I did anything, are there any questions, Charisse, that are burning, or can we leave those to the end, do you think?
There's one question that was a little bit of a clarifying question, so maybe that's a good one for now, and we'll save others for later.
Sure.
So this question is, how does recognizing God as God relate to human hierarchies? Maybe I misunderstood what was said about bolding. So that recognizing God as God, what about humans? Is there a hierarchy under that?
I guess what I was trying to say is that Bolding's conception of God is a particularly, I would say, hierarchical and even patriarchal conception of God. And I think there are other ways of thinking about God that do not that don't embrace hierarchy in the same way that uh, and I'm sorry, I'm not expressing this well. I will continue to think about it, and maybe at the end of the time when we enter into our discussion, I'll have a better way of saying what I'm trying to say about Bolding's conception of hierarchy and theology.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Welling. All right. So our next presenter is Lisa Graustein, and she'll be talking about reparative actions as a guide for stewarding wealth. Lisa's presentation is part of a larger lifetime's work of repairing the harm done by generations of her family as settler colonists in the United States. Lisa, take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Charisse. Thank you, friends, for being here. As Christy said, my name is Lisa Graustein. I use she, her pronouns. I am going to share with you a little bit about who I am because I am not an academic, and this is my first conference of this kind. And so I want you to understand where I am coming from as it pertains to this presentation. So I am a lifelong Quaker. Here I am with a bunch of young friends. I am the descendant of some early colonists in Connecticut and architects of genocide there, as well as a descendant of later immigrants, mostly from Prussia and Persia. I have a family foundation, or my family has a foundation from generational inherited wealth that is in Connecticut that focuses on equity and education by addressing racism and poverty. And I'm the chair of the board of that foundation. I am a career educator. I've mostly been a public high school teacher that I've taught everything from sixth grade through now college math and humanities. I'm a DEI trainer and facilitator, and I most recently just finished co-facilitating the second cohort of the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism. And I'm a mom, an auntie, and community member. And so I'm coming to this work with all of those identities and backgrounds for what I'm going to talk with you about this morning. I want to acknowledge my sources. A lot of my learning has come from the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA, as well as from the UN guidelines around what reparations are and how they need to be laid out. I've done a lot of learning from Cultural Survival, both from its founder and from its current staff and membership. And then a lot of my learning has also come from Dr. David Ragland and my work in a cohort called Ancestors and Money for People with Inherited Wealth. And I met Mary Watkins, who's one of the panelists tomorrow, through that fantastic program. The other source of the information I'm bringing and sharing today comes from my relationships with organizations, from communities of practice of both folks with inherited wealth, engaged in reparations, as well as multi-economic, multiracial, diverse groups of folks in communities of practice committed to justice and reparations, personal relationships with individuals, and then work I've been doing over the last half decade to reconnect to my ancestral spiritual practices from the people from whom I'm descended before we were white, before we were Christianized, so that I can engage in spiritual practices that are less contaminated by white supremacy and bring those into conversation with modern day Quakerism. I'm going to talk real quickly about reparations, kind of as the initial frame, and then I will go into more detail. So reparations involves restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. I'll talk about each of these in more detail in a few moments. Reparations is something that governments and institutions can offer and need to offer, and there are many in this country that do. Yearly meetings and Quaker organizations are institutions that can make reparations. And so part of why I'm here today is I'm hoping to add to the conversation that's growing among friends, at least in the United States, around what are the reparations we owe to different communities of people on this continent. What's missing from that definition is the centrality of community. And so the previous definition comes from the United Nations. And what I have learned from Indigenous communities, from other BIPOC communities that I spend time in, is that reparations can't happen without the communities to which the reparations are being made being central at every step of the process. And that involves free, prior, informed consent. And so we can't make reparations without being in direct relationship and not in the ways that we're used to if we're coming from a white perspective, a higher class perspective, highly educated academic perspective. We need to be in a different orientation and relationship with the communities to which we're making reparations. So reparations, as I said, are things that institutions can do. This notion of reparative actions I learned from Dr. David Ragland, and they are actions using the pillars of reparations as guideposts that individuals and small groups can take. They work in parallel and in support of formal reparations, and they're starting places and points of entry that often when we say reparations to the bodies that need to offer reparations, immediately hands go up and how could we figure that out? And who would we know who should get them? And where would the money come from? And we just kind of create all this instant defensiveness. And what I really appreciate about the notion of reparative actions is each of us can do a reparative action today. We can do one tomorrow. We can do one next week. We don't have to have everything figured out, but it's a starting place that then helps us answer these bigger questions. And all those defensive questions are very easily answerable, actually. So before I look at how I can step into doing reparative actions, I need to look at how I'm using power. And so I've got to look at what are the points and axis of power that I've got in this situation. So I have access to financial institutions. I have skills in labor. I'm a highly educated person. I've got a lot of skills, a lot of things I can do. And I currently have a very able body, so I can really put my time and energy behind things. I have positional power, both claimed and given in the different spaces in which I operate and move. I have vast and varied networks that I am a part of. I have a lot of social capital, both things that are given to me positionally in society, and then through the networks and goodwill I have built up with people over time. I have access to white people. I'm a white person. Some of my best friends are white people. And I am the chair of a foundation, and through that and through other organizations that I'm a part of, I have access to institutional finances. When I was active in my yearly meeting, while I wasn't on the finance committee, because of the way Quakers do business, right, I could have influence over our finances, or could try to have influence. And so the spiritual orientation for me here is how am I using my power at every level to dismantle white supremacy? And I'm putting that as a spiritual orientation and not just a pragmatic movement, because white supremacy infiltrates every aspect of our being and is counter to how God wishes us to live. So now I'm going to go through and talk about each of these pillars of reparations and what it can look like. So restitution is about restoring the community to the original state of being before the harm. I'm going to read that again with a pause because it's so powerful to me. Restoration is about restoring the community to the original state of being before the harm. So if we think about all the groups of people that were harmed in the creation and maintenance of the United States and what it would look like to restore all of those communities to the original state of being before harm, I can think of no greater spiritual work for us to do in our lifetime. So for me, I ask, how can I work to restore BIPOC communities? And how can I work to restore my people, knowing that white supremacy functions by those of us who are white doing some version of the harm to ourselves before we do it to all the other peoples of the world? So what this has looked like is supporting BIPOC community-led liberatory projects with funds, with networking, with labor, working with white people to tell the truth about what we've done and what we are doing, working with communities and organizers and connecting them with financial and wealth building resources. Because of my economic, positional and other social powers and inherited wealth, I have access to tremendous institutions that folks who are seeking to build wealth who've been denied those resources don't, and where I can make those connections. I'm working to change philanthropy in the region in which I work, and then reclaiming the ethnic identities and connection to my pre-white and pre-settler heritage. And the spiritual orientation here is about making all parts of my life spirit-led and justice-oriented, because again, the economics of white supremacy are counter to spirit and are counter to justice. Compensation talks about providing compensation for the physical, mental, economic, political, and other losses as a result of the harm that was done. So how can I compensate for the harm my lineage has done? What this has looked like is engaging in direct redistribution of wealth through equitable SUSUs, through buying black debt, through other institutions that are run by BIPOC community members that allow for direct one-on-one redistribution of wealth. Using my credit score and collateral for BIPOC folks' survival and wealth building, my name is currently on somewhere between 20 and 30 leases and mortgages, where I lend my credit score to people so that they can get a better mortgage as a way of buying property and wealth building, where I'm using my networking and the different pieces that I bring in labor in service of BIPOC folks working in this area. My family foundation, which is a family foundation, so usually just has family members on the board. We are majority community members. Over half of our board members are current or former grantees. And so where we're sharing the distribution and redistribution decision-making power with BIPOC community members. And then within the foundation, making sure that our investment policy statement is fully aligned with our mission so that the corpus of the endowment is working in service of the mission, not just the few grant dollars going out, and then engaging in mission-related investments, program-related investments, putting a lot of our cash in credit unions and other institutions that immediately put capital into communities. And the spiritual orientation here is understanding wealth not as a thing that needs to be hoarded and held on to, but as a tool of repair and as a flow of energy. And when we start to think about money as a flow of energy and as a tool of repair, it really changes the relationship at an institutional level, at least. I'm not going to make assumptions about people's own home economics. Rehabilitation is providing for the medical, psychological, and other care to address the immediate and long-term impacts of the harm. So how do I support healing? That's changing the structures within the organizations and institutions that I'm a part of to address how white supremacy and racism continue to be perpetuated. So changing the structures that allow the harm to continue, as well as changing the cultural practices. One of my father's favorite phrases is culture will eat structure for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If we don't do the structural changes, the harm is institutionalized. If we don't make the cultural changes, whatever structural changes we're making aren't going to matter. And then where I'm putting, again, money and labor into BIPOC-led healing spaces, and there's a number here that I name. And then I have question marks because I'm still really trying to figure this one out and how to do that healing work. And the spiritual orientation here is how am I a part of the healing and harm reduction? So this next one talks about how we do the deep truth-telling that is needed. In the case of physical genocides, it's actually the locating of bodies, people who have been removed from their homes. It's the official restoration of dignity, commemoration for victims. So how do I understand my lineage's part in the harming of BIPOC communities, and what amends and repair can I offer? This looks like a number of things. So it's researching and learning the history of what my family has done. It's telling that history to the generation above me, to my generation, and the generations after me. It's offering apology and repair, and it's returning stolen items with the offer for amends. My family doesn't have, besides land, many stolen items, but the ones that I have been able to return have done so with ceremony, with prayer in a spiritual context. And that's the notion of rematriation versus repatriation. And cultural survival has great information about that. And so the spiritual orientation here is truth-telling at a deep level that I think friends are committed to, but culturally, at least in the sphere in which I exist with Quakers, we don't always do and often fall short of. And I know there's people on this call who are doing deep work to do the truth-telling of our part in some of the forms of genocide that have happened and that we have been a part of. Guarantee of non-repetition is about creating laws and social practices such that the harm that has happened can never happen again. So how am I working to end white supremacy at every level? That looks like redistribution of money, both my own and then collective monies, again, Quaker monies, other monies that I have access to. It's the deep, long, messy work with other white people. It's working for transformation and justice within the different communities that I'm a part of. It means how I'm raising my child and my nibblings and the other kids in my circle very differently than how I was raised. And it's a commitment to doing my own ongoing learning and repair work. And so for me, the spiritual orientation here is foundationing the realm of the divine or the kingdom. And I want to close with this final image because this is an ancestral image from my people before we were white, before we were Christian. There's many versions of it. This I did as a large needlepoint prayer practice in advance of one of the healing spaces that I was talking about a few moments ago. But it's a reminder that I actually come from a people who understood this is what life is supposed to look like, that we are inherently interdependent, that we move seasonally and cyclically, that everything is a part of the whole, and if any one piece of this were to be harmed, it would harm the whole. And I come from a people that for a long time have forgotten that that's how we're supposed to live, that that's how we're supposed to move, and that this is the world that God envisions for us. So thank you. I think I'm just at my time here.
You actually still had, what is that, a minute and 40 seconds, so you were fine. Thank you so much, Lisa. We really appreciate that. And I have to personally admit that I really love that image that you shared at the end, and we'd love to be able to, maybe share that image somewhere else because that's gorgeous. Thank you for that. All right, so as Charisse dropped in the chat at the beginning of Lisa's presentation, if you had any questions for Lisa during the presentation, again, this is for the whole day, for Stuart and for Jim as well. If you have any questions while the presentation is happening, just go ahead and drop it in the chat to Charisse, and she will happily share it with me, and we will talk. So, Charisse, do we have any questions from Lisa?
Yeah, let's start with this one from a friend in Africa who's saying that they're thinking about Africa where government leaders are looting for personal gain. In such case, how can restitution and compensation be attained? Are there ways that this kind of translates into that sort of context?
Yeah, I'm really sorry that's happening, and I'm hesitant to speak about another nation, another context in which I'm fairly unfamiliar. I will say the United Nations has a lot of resources about how people can ask for and seek reparations for harm done by institutions or governments. And I know that they have done deep and significant work, particularly in East Africa. And so I think I would probably direct you to the United Nations, and I'm happy to put a link in the chat in a few moments with more information. But I think my expertise falls far short of the situation in which you're talking about.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. All right. So we're moving on to Stuart Smith, who is going to be talking about the abolition that could have been, the free produce movement, and the loss of momentum in ending chattel slavery in America, 1800 to 1860. Um, I love academic titles because I feel like it's kind of like German, like everything's in there and everything it has to be in there is in there. So you just know that it's just a big clump and you got to work through it. And then you're like, wow, that's kind of awesome because it's all there. Anyway, Stuart, thank you so much. And his presentation ties into his dissertation, which focuses on developing learning targets for nonviolent social activists. Stuart, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor. I do appreciate it, friends. I'm glad you're all here. I did see a couple of names briefly. I puddled around and saw folks. I'm going to see if I can share this correctly. Let's see here. Oh, well, I'll just share it that way. Let's see if that works. Oh, gosh darn it. Here we go. Right, not that. Here we go. This is what I want, folks. I'm going to bring this up. Here we are. Thumbs up if you see that. Great. Thank you, friends. So the abolition that could have been, the longer and, as friend Christy says, tedious title, right? Free produce. It's an element we'll talk about here. I'm a doctoral student in Quaker Studies at the University of Birmingham. I work out here in California. I'm an educator. I'm a theater artist by training. I've got a lot of different hats I've worn. But today I'm working with this particular combination uh, of economics and I think a little bit of theology put in the right context. So I have a lot of elements here. If you want the larger paper of this, I am going to drop it into ResearchGate when we're all done. If things happen, we may end up publishing through the discussion group. We'll see how that goes. But more importantly, we're going to start with some bigger ideas. Because the free produce movement, if some of you know it, some of you may not, the mid-1800s, it stands out. It's a novel, admirably ambitious idea. You abolish slavery by removing its economic appeal. Campaign had moral unity. But there's a tactical schism, which ultimately doomed it in the face of swelling violence. The old moral fervor of demanding blood from the enslavers in payment for the blood of the enslaved overpowered the cold calculations of free market capitalism. However, in terms of the realpolitik of the situation, we can look retrospectively and understand that, in fact, the free produce movement did the vanguard work of field testing a tactic that could very well have advanced the cause of abolition decades ahead of the bloodiest armed conflict in American history, which we know makes worldwide waves across the global economy today. Now, in one sense, this is just a speculative exercise. We know in the real world, the free produce movement faded out. John Brown leads a terrorist attack on Harper's Ferry and is captured, tried, and executed. He takes with him any hope of peaceful abolition. A new political party sweeps into Congress and the White House. A wave of secessions ensues, followed almost immediately by war that claims more American lives than really any war up until, I think, the Vietnam conflict. But for the sake of those dead, I think we have to ask about the freedom that could have been. A plan for manumission, it would have cost not blood, it would have cost treasure, though. What could have happened in an America that merely flirted with disaster instead of embracing it, right? And to that, we're going to go back to the British Quaker Elizabeth Hayrick. And if you've seen this title before, she published a pamphlet in 1824 called Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition. And of course, because of its time, there's a much longer title after that. It's a very forthright piece. It's very bold. And her work, she doesn't attempt to hide her disgust with her fellow activists who don't wish their slaveholding fellows to be seen as impolitic. And she says, yeah, she's not worried about being rude. She just says it. Her goal is to replace what she calls the gains of unrighteousness with the united expression of individual opinion in the form of a boycott. It's important to say boycott wasn't even a term yet. That's going to be coming way down at the end of the 1800s in an Irish protest against English tenancy. But she essentially removes the idea of using enslaved labor and replacing it with what's going to be called known as free produce, goods, services provided without the chain and the lash. But changing the point of origin of the sugar in your tea might seem a little incommensurate to the task of holding back violent revolution, but from our own perspective, 150 years later, we've embraced economic activism, and we can see that it's markedly effective. So the free produce activists who organized in the wake of Hayrick's pamphlet and others turned the moral focus of institutional slavery away from wrath and towards avarice. And if you look at the seven deadly sins, that is the essential shift. Punishing greed, if you assume that society's responsibility is to punish the sinful, if that's the term you're using in the time, is historically quite different from punishing those who commit the other deadly sins. So if greed is your driver of human suffering, who becomes your instructor? Adam Smith, founder of modern economics, right? But it's not just Adam Smith, it's his contemporary, his Quaker contemporary, all the way out in New Jersey, which is John Woolman. And we see our portraits there of Smith and Woolman facing off as they never did in their tag team in real life, right? John Woolman has his plea for the poor and lays out, no uncertain terms, how the act of participation in an economy creates not just opportunity, but obligation. He has section 2 of the plea. He condemns practices that yield unequal rewards. And that's his key phrase, I think, that really we can work with. But Adam Smith, he's well known for Wealth of Nations, but he had another piece that's not as well read, but the theory of moral sentiments actually talks about the basic DNA of what we now consider ethical consumerism. And he talks about what I mentioned here, the agreeable prison, or the agreeable palace, rather, and the disagreeable prison. And it goes like this. He says, the prison, he says, looks disagreeable. And in fact, he says the more disagreeable it is, the better, right? Because it's supposed to be a place no one wants to go. And yet it serves an agreeable function because it helps maintain civil society. He says a palace, on the contrary, will always be agreeable, yet its remote effects may often be inconvenient to the public. It may serve to promote luxury and set the example of the dissolution of matters. Its immediate effects, however, the conveniency, the pleasure, the gaiety of the people who live in it, being all agreeable and suggesting to the imagination 1,000 agreeable ideas. It's not too tenuous a stretch to look at the agreeable effects of having affordable sugar, cotton, indigo, and similar products derived from enslaved labor as this industrial version of Adam Smith's agreeable palace. So Hayrick and the free produce advocates shift the focus morally from, in one big step, because they abjure gambling, because the earnings aren't reflective of any effort expended by the gambler, but instead the losings of others. The sin which empowers a slaveholder is not wrath, it's avarice. And the Old Testament reminds us the soul of the lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. In Matthew 25, it says the unprofitable servant shall be cast into darkness. So all of these theological underpinnings combine with this economic movement. And Lawrence Glickman had a 2004 overview of the free produce movement. It was very, very authoritative. And he talks about the foundational shift, and he says free produce activists turned the notion of abolition on its head. shifting the focus away from the South and its slaveholders to the North and its consumers of slave-made products. So 19th century abolitionists make the ethical leap from direct responsibility of the enslaver to the indirect culpability of the consumer. Now, that being said, this is an innovation, and innovations involved in any tactical innovation can have susceptibilities. And the limitations of the early international trade economy, particularly in antebellum America, are great. The free produce groups and stores start appearing across the solidly abolitionist quarters of Pennsylvania, Ohio, from the 1820s onwards. You've got notable figures like Benjamin Lundy, George W. Taylor at the forefront of them, and Lucretia Mott working to support a bunch of others. However, even Lundy's store in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, right there on the Pennsylvania border, he's longer lived than many others in his efforts, has such difficulties operating at scale and with sufficient quality of goods. It regularly operated at a loss by the time the worsening tensions of the 1840s arose. In 1942, Ruth Neuenberger does a dissertation on the free produce movement. It's really, really thorough. And she goes into painful detail as to how often Taylor and others were looking in vain, he says, to manifest the free produce they'd promised to the market share, right? Her research shows store after store fails to even turn a modest profit. The most recent work, if anyone knows Julie Holcomb, she teaches at Baylor. Her new book, Moral Commerce, it's only been out for a few years. It's a really rigorously researched piece, and it takes great pains to qualify. Another big reason is that as Quakers see more and more mainstream abolitionists arise who are not Quakers, they themselves sort of taper off. And so it's a big, tough combination. So the complexity of international trade makes it tough. And into the situation, when the economy experiment isn't working so well, comes a single attack. In 1859, it immediately galvanizes both the abolitionist movement and the economic and political wings of slave power. The place is Harper's Ferry. And the man at the eye of the hurricane is John Brown. Within 18 months, Harper's Ferry, the newly founded Republican Party, sweeps Congress and the White House. A confederation of states leaves the Union. The man who arrested John Brown, Mexican War veteran Robert E. Lee, leads an army against the nation that bore him. So that's the end of free produce in realistic terms, because after that, the war happens and the 13th Amendment gets passed. But there's a conundrum in evaluating the whole free produce movement. The movement has no guarantee of success because it's new. Elizabeth Hayrick herself, when she puts her first pamphlet out, calls for immediate abolition, but she says it would be better for the enslaved worker that no efforts had been made for his emancipation, rather than the efforts be taken feebly. And I don't know that feeble is an accurate term, considering thousands of people did at some point engage in free produce. But it remains for us to really look at it as a strategy. It's a failed strategy, and yet we need to figure out why. And Lucretia Mott, who is shown here, has a really interesting look at it because her son-in-law, Edward Davis, is really holds kind of his whole abolitionist stance in opposition to free produce in many ways. And he's kind of chastising Elizabeth Pease, who's a free producer, and he complains to her. He says, he kind of holds his nose up to her and says, she would force slavery from its present location by appealing to the avaricious feelings of the slaveholder. We, he says, my italics, exterminate it by appealing to his conscience and understanding. So that really kind of gives you a sense of this moral high ground being more important, right, than succeeding. It doesn't feel like a win, essentially, to let slave power continue to have economic influence, right? And that's a really tough situation. Economically, they see it's an anti-competitive behavior to use enslaved labor, but you don't have the tools to make it work, and it doesn't feel like a win, right? Curtis Childs is a sociologist at BYU, and he has a really interesting social responsible investment rubric. And he says suppliers have to inspire emotional reactions. And he says practitioners have to have good relations with their suppliers. They need to know that they're making a difference. You know, and by that count, the free produce movement should have been a slam dunk. What's different is they have some basic mechanical problems. The modern economy works at scale. We can target markets. We can have clear supply chains. I love chocolate. I can get single bean Ghanaian free chocolate, free trade chocolate. Order. I can go through my phone and find it. It can come to me directly. Those tools just weren't available. So those integrations with the supply chain, none of that really works back in the free produce movement. So what you do is you have to look at this idea that Julie Holcomb comes to the idea that complicity is the essential change. And we work with Thomas Kuhn, whose idea of the paradigm shift was so important. And he said new ideas have to redefine the old circumstances. And so it takes time to get used to these new ideas. Ultimately, it's a radical idea. The world maybe wasn't ready for it, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try, right? And so we come to John Paul Lederach, the Mennonite peace builder, who has the concept of divine naivete. And he says, naive just means newly created. Every good strategy is newly created at some point. And he says, if it fails, that's all the more burden that we should follow and learn from its mistakes, right? And the idea there is, if it failed, yeah, but did it lead the way to better things? Sure. And so it's the abolition that could have been, it wasn't, but it does mean the idea was wrong for trying because you've got to be more ambitious than maybe you're able to do. And I'll close with Robert Browning's famous poem, Andrea del Sarto, the painting artist. He says, oh, the critics don't understand that, yeah, sure, my painting might not have been good, but you got to reach for the stars because your reach should exceed your grasp, or what's a heaven for, right? So that's the nature of the free produce movement, a failed experiment, but definitely worth investigating as a tactic, as a choice to reinforce our hopes and our ambitions. Folks, thank you very much. My name is Stuart Smith, and if you want to go into ResearchGate, I'll send that material off to you some point, or it'll be there for you to see, hopefully the next couple of days. There's a longer version of this with some notes and bibliography. My Gmail is there also if you want it, and the folks here running the panel can also send you my information if you want to get a hold of me. I really appreciate folks' time. Thank you so very much. Let me end my sharing. There we go. All right, folks, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Stuart. That was wonderful. And I have to admit, I really, at this moment in our national history, I feel like your presentation, had my brain thinking of interesting thoughts for how to deal
Good.
with, now, shall we say. Um,
Good.
so we had one question I wanted to ask as a clarifying, and then again I wanted to move on to Jim and then our conversation. But a number of people have asked if there's a place to read or to find the pamphlets that you mentioned, specifically Hayrick's pamphlet.
Oh yeah, I'll gosh, I'll see if I can pass you all the material. Okay, I will, while the next presentation is going, I'll drop a couple of things into the chat. Herrick's pamphlet is freely available. It's public domain. There's a couple of really nice ones. There's actually a specific element, if you're interested in more academic writing, there are two economists at Berkeley in the 1970s who did this amazing thing to tie into what friend Lisa talked about, which is that they did the hard work of actually figuring out how unfair enslaved labor was in the 1800s, with a sense of how much profiteering was made, how little they profited from the labor they themselves exerted. Fascinating piece of work. It's economic, it's dense, but the basics are not that hard to follow. And there's a couple pieces like that that I'd love people to examine. I'll see if I can put some of those pieces in the chat as we go, or at least afterwards. So there's several links. I'll look for those and I'll send them in. Thank you, folks, for asking. I do appreciate that.
Absolutely. And we're going to be sending out links to the recordings for today and tomorrow in email form, obviously. And we can, if there's a few like really key links that you wanted to include, we can sort of include those in the email as well. So thank you so much. All right. So our next presenter is Jim Fussell, The World-Shaking Power of Holy Obedience. Radical U.S. Quakers divesting from nuclear arms, McCarthyism, and racial segregation, 1946 to 1956. Wow, there's a lot going on there. So one final thing about Jim himself, his engagement with mid-20th century Quaker history is inspired in part by our current period of high political anxiety, something I very much would agree with Jim. He's a scholar in residence at the Earlham School of Religion, and this is his first presentation to the QTDG. Jim, great to have you. The floor is yours. You're still muted, Jim.
Muted. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My presentation today is focused on a whole variety of events that were happening in the decade after World War II amongst Quakers. Probably not a majority of U.S. Quakers, but a significant minority of Quakers. And I've tried to conceive of those actions through a lecture given in March of 1939 by Thomas Kelly, who at that time had just returned for the previous summer he had spent in Germany amongst Quakers there. Um, Kelly's lecture became, I believe it's chapter 3 of A Testament of Devotion, which became one of the best-selling books of that time, not just amongst Quakers, but amongst the U.S. public generally. And before that book was published, Kelly died very suddenly at age 46 in January of 1941. So many people see Testament of Devotion as a book of contemplative mysticism for individual seekers. My reading of the lecture Holy Obedience is different from that, and I see Kelly urging groups of Quakers to become bands of prophets and to shake off their comfortable lives. He uses the example of the main line in Germantown, and he believes that there is an immense power in the peace of Christ Jesus that is accessible to Quakers and others, that is more powerful than the powers of the world. And Kelly asserts that this inward peace found in the living Christ is more powerful than weapons of war and systems and structures of oppression. And he believed that small groups of Quakers could wield this power. And this picture behind everything is Bad Pyrmont, where Germany yearly meeting met when he was there. One of the remarkable things I found in my research was 3 nationwide called meetings of Quakers that were cross-branch meetings in the sense that there were pastoral and friends in the waiting worship or silent tradition. There were conservative friends. I think in some cases there were even evangelical friends who participated in these conferences. And the first was at Earlham College in the summer of 1948, a called meeting on conscription and war that occurred just 5 or 6 weeks after Congress reinstated the draft after it had lapsed. And they wrote a set of advices and queries that became known as the Richmond Declaration. And over the next several years, people cited it. The last time I've seen it cited was in 1968. There was a second conference 6 years or nearly 6 years later at Scattergood Friends School on civil liberties, especially looking into loyalty oaths. And then 2 years after that, a conference on civil rights and Quakers, or as they said at the time, race relations. And these are all excerpts from the statements that came out of these conferences. They all it's hard to know who went to these conferences, but I do have some idea of who initiated them. I want to also say there was not a conference on nuclear weapons by Quakers at this time, but many Quakers responded to it. This is a statement by Baltimore Yearly Meeting just a few months after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, in which they give a spiritual response to the bombings and speak about the sorrow and guilt they feel. In a sense, the end of World War II for Quakers who were awake to this was not a beginning of peace, but a continuation of fear and war. And there were also statements by North Carolina Yearly Meeting and by a number of notable Quaker leaders. And so what we have here is the post-war economy becoming what in 1961 would be known as the military-industrial complex, with a national security state and a nationwide climate of fear. And Quakers, I would say probably most Quakers adapted to that and lived with it. Well, a significant minority of Quakers engaged in actions of resistance or of constructive program that showed an alternative way. This presentation focuses on the oppositional response to the emerging military-industrial complex, civil disobedience to segregation laws, which was also very much what Quakers were engaged in, including and resistance to military preparations and the refusal to swear or sign loyalty oaths. And I'll not in this, equally interesting is the proactive and constructive activities Quakers were engaged in. It's not possible to address that today. In terms of civil rights, there was during World War II and immediately before it, in the spring of 1941, there was a fast emerging civil rights movement that in 1947 was pretty much the Cold War atmosphere and the anti-communist atmosphere caused that a halt to that movement. And here are some of the Quakers or Quaker adjacent people who are engaged with that. Bayard Rustin, who's gotten so much attention recently, most preeminent, and very much this whole presentation could be seen as the people who are involved with Bayard Rustin in the first part of his life, before the emergence of Martin Luther King and others. Here is a map of the US with going back to 42 and as late as 64 showing engagement by Quakers in civil rights, and some of the many examples of that. And going on to military conscription, here is something that happened at Earlham College, something parallel happened at William Penn University in Iowa. It was a college then. And at Earlham, when the draft came back, over a dozen young men refused to register. And here is the picture of the Peace Fellowship in the spring of 48 when there was no draft. The following fall of 48, multiple students were declaring they would not register, including here's William Wildman, the son of a chemistry professor. And here in the center is Lorton Husel, who went on to become the 20 years later, the General Secretary of Friends United Meeting. And it's notable that at least one of these people, Francis Henderson, who went on to become a teacher at Oakwood School, cited the Richmond Declaration at his trial, and he wasn't the only one. There were others from this group and other Quakers around the country who resisted in this time period. There was even one Quaker in New York State who burned his draft card, something we usually associate with the 1960s. And here it was not only resisting the draft, but there were multiple people, including many Quaker women, who were refusing to pay their war taxes. There were also people refusing to be part of the mandatory military training or ROTC program. And there were people such as Joan Baez at age 17 who was refusing to, this before she had any, a year before she had her first record album, when she was refusing to participate in civil defense drills at her high school. And Deborah Haynes, who some of us may know, did the same thing in New York State. So many examples here. And in the center, in the pale green, or is the conference. Here is a group of women who took action, and they're at Homewood Meeting across the street from Johns Hopkins University. And they were public employees in the state of Maryland, which was one of the first states to establish a loyalty oath, and they refused to sign that oath. Most of these women were unmarried professional women, and they fought first in the first appeal, they won. The second appeal, they lost, and then they lost their jobs. 17 years later, 1967, Supreme Court ruled in their favor. Most of them were at retirement age at that point. And here's an example of where Quakers resisting loyalty oaths around the country was happening at that same time. A significant group of Quakers and Unitarians in Oklahoma, for example. In Southern California, the Quaker meetings, in order to continue to be nonprofits, were asked to sign loyalty oaths, and Orange Grove in Southern California refused, as well as other California yearly meetings. Moving on, something I'd like to have had more time to address is these actions by Quakers were drawing, and books like Thomas Kelly's were drawing many people into Quakers, including there were many Protestant clergy whose ideas about racial equality and pacifism was making them unwelcome in their own denominations, and many people from backgrounds beyond the white Anglo population. And here are some people from India, a Gandhian, from Germany, Bayard Rustin. We've heard a lot about Katsuki James Hatsaka, another Earlham student who protested at Oak Ridge in Tennessee against Hiroshima in 1949. And later, actually, in Los Angeles, where he was an architect, he was a campaigner for reparations for Japanese Americans. He had been in a wartime camp as well as being a conscience objector. Here are some examples besides Katsuki James Hatsaka, where Quakers protested nuclear weapons in this period. I also want to note that some Quakers just left the country. We've all probably have heard about Monteverde School and Meeting in Costa Rica, which was founded in the fall of 1950. At the same time, a group went to Alaska, which was then a territory, and formed a meeting. 11 couples went to Costa Rica, 4 Quaker couples went to Alaska, 7 Quaker couples and their families went to British Columbia. And then there were individuals, especially wanted to note African American Quakers who left the country in this time period. A woman, Mahala Ashley Dickerson, an attorney in Indianapolis, was refused membership with her teenage sons in Indianapolis First Friends Church. She went to Alaska and started her own Quaker meeting. There was another Black sociologist who went to Ontario, Wilson Head. A number of other people, St. Clair Drake, went to Ghana. And here are some of the African American Quakers or Quaker adjacent people from this period. I wanted to note that 4 of them, Drake, Sutherland, Dickerson rather, and Head, all left the country, as I just noted. And then there were also some people who had not been Quakers in the early 50s who exited from the military-industrial complex. One, Jim Lanehart, a codebreaker for the NSA, which was then a very secret agency in Maryland, and Bill Lecht, who worked in biochemical warfare, making nerve gas. Both of them left their professions and became Quakers. I'm going to, in the interest of, no, going back to the same essay by Thomas Kelly. This is a picture by his son of him by the ocean in Maine. He asserts that the mark of the simplified life from holy obedience is one of radiant joy. And knowing sorrow in the depths, it does not agonize, fret, or strain, but becomes serene, unhurried, and calm. It walks in a time of joy and the insurance of eternity. And many of the Quakers who engaged in acts of civil disobedience, they threw away their careers, they went to prison, they risked their lives in some cases. They were able to do that from a kind of faith-inspired activism like Kelly had suggested. And here is a more contemporary friend, Jenny Isabel Shin of Mount Toby meeting, who in Quaker speak also addresses that kind of faith-inspired activism. So I want to ask those of you gathered today, how do we interpret this history? Does this I've counted over 150 Quakers involved in this period in this kind of radical Quaker activism. Was this a revival or reformation of U.S. Quakerism or an attempt at it? Do we call these people Kellyites in the same way sometimes people speak of Bensonites, followers of Lewis Benson, or of course Hicksites and Gurneyites? Do we consider this group of people a kind of mid-20th century parallel to the Valiant 60 of the 1650s? Does this suggest to us that maybe we should look at movements and groups of Quakers as our basic unit of study and take less attention to individual Quakers, which is usually the pattern of Quaker history? Individual Quakers or Quaker institutions. So those are the questions I want to close with. I'm surprised you haven't interrupted me to tell me time's up.
I wanted to I like to have people have the chance to finish what they're saying first, and then
Okay.
I can, sort of jump in. Um,
Yes.
Thank you, Jim, for
Okay.
that. And again, like with Stuart, it's sort of getting my mind thinking about what's going on right now, and the ways that we might respond to it. And in light of that, very briefly, I wanted to ask if, well, and somebody asked this question here, how, if you could briefly talk about how deeply did the ideas, presented in these called meetings that you were talking about, how deeply do they actually penetrate into Quakerism, generally? Did people follow what they said? Was there an effort to make these meetings representative of, yearly or monthly meetings? So yeah, you can sort of, briefly give an overview or say, I'm going to talk about that later.
The third one on civil rights in 1956 became the first of about 8 meetings that happened every 2 years over the next 15 years. And I would say there was a significant penetration into the wider society from that. It's a little bit harder to judge about the first two. The one at Scattergood on civil liberties may have come a little bit too late and came after the storm, so to speak. And so the significance happened before that one. The first one is really a mystery. It's hard to tell who was there. It happened in July. The president of Earlham College was away when it happened. it seems to have had an impact on some of the Earlham faculty. And as it noted, there were 17 yearly meetings represented. And I guess the best way to judge is that there was activity throughout the country in terms of Quakers involved in resistance to war taxes and to conscription. Because we don't know who was at the meeting, it's hard to know exactly the impact.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. So, Lisa and Welling and Stewart, I'm going to go through asking each of you a specific question. And then once we've sort of had that round, then we'll see what emerges from that. So I'm going to start off with Welling. Um, uh, is there or did you run across in your research any descriptions of how Elise Boulding may have influenced her husband? Obviously, both of them were, I mean, towering figures in 20th century sort of Quaker thought, and they definitely were sort of influencing back and forth. But in a way, like how did Elise impact Kenneth, or is there any record of that? Or yeah, just basically speak on that.
Sure. Thank you, Christy. You know, I considered that in the I did not find that directly in any of Boulding's writings specifically on theology and religion. What I was really surprised about was the essay that I mentioned that he wrote in 1942, which embraces such a patriarchal supremacist version of God. I mean, I wish that I Lisa's presentation helped me uh, to put this language on that particular presentation at Pendle Hill was so consistent with what I now regard as being a white supremacist vision of a patriarchal God. It was published in 1942, and I thought, well, maybe 50 years later, he would have had a profoundly different idea. And I was really surprised then that essay was republished in 1993 with a preface by Elise that I don't read as saying, Kenneth really changed his ideas since then, and this is a rejection. So I welcome the question, and unfortunately, given the research that I've done so far and given the materials I've looked at so far, I can't say Elise had this particular influence in this way. In the economic thinking. I mean, she of course was very involved in the consortium on peace research, education, and development, which is where he and Elise and some other folks really developed started to develop the field of peace research. But in terms of her influence on his economic thinking, I'm not able to do that. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. And sometimes what I love is that questions will emerge that are like, oh, well, that should bloom into a research project for somebody. So if any of the 30 plus people we have on this call feel moved to do the research on the impact that Elise and Kenneth had on each other, that would be fascinating work, and I think would really benefit our understanding of both of these figures. Thank you, Welling. All right, Lisa, you had a lot of questions in relation to sort of white supremacy and the impact on white supremacy on sort of everything basically. So uh, um, I guess the question I want to begin with is how do you work on restoration when the harm is ongoing? So if we think of white supremacy is still here, and we think of it as like this thing that is still harming literally everyone in little nicks and cuts in so many different ways, like basically how do we respond to it when it seems like everything we do is at best two steps forward, one step back, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, and we just voted for it, right? We just voted in a white supremacist administration. Like, let's be
Yes, we
really
did.
clear collectively as a nation what we just did and are in the
Yeah.
process of doing. And we rejected a Black woman who was giving us an alternative that would have been much healthier. So, right, we start somewhere, right? So what is your sphere of influence? What can you do? 10 years ago, we wouldn't be saying white supremacy like this in this kind of a Quaker setting. People would have been like, oh, I mean, I remember we talked about it at my yearly meeting. People felt the word was too harsh. So we had to do all this like gentle hand holding to get a bunch of white folks to be able to name white supremacy. Now we can talk about it with a little bit more fluency. So I think we start everywhere and anywhere, right? And that's what the point I was trying to get across with reparative actions is you don't have to have the big, huge thing figured out. You have to say, here's the next step I'm going to take. And I think what is particularly critical for those of us living in the United States is we are about to enter into a time of rampant authoritarianism and chaos and white supremacy in the streets in ways we haven't seen in a long time and in some new ways. And so, whatever we're doing now, each of us has to take some step forwards and bring some other people with us. And so it's the conversations, it's bringing it up in our meetings. To me, one of the single greatest things East Coast liberal Quakers, at least, that's the body I'm a part of, could do would be to actually focus on the actions behind our minutes as opposed to the wordsmithing of our minutes. We need to get out of our meeting houses. We need to be doing work in community. Those of us who are white, need to put ourselves in service to BIPOC leadership, and we need to start doing it yesterday.
Amen. Thank you. And I have to, we thought about these panels in relation to so many different things, but I have to admit that personally, I felt like the last month, my understanding of the world must shift, and we all need to sort of take that on as a necessary, awareness is to be recognizing how the world is shifting around us, I guess.
Yeah, and I'll just say, so Welling started off by inviting us to imagining, right? We need to imagine the world that isn't yet. And then the Stuart and Jim both gave us multitude examples of friends who are willing to step outside the norm to try to make that imagination real. So we have the tools, we have the models, we have more models for what it looks like to resist oppression than any other people on the earth have ever had before, right? We need to humble ourselves, listen to them, and follow them.
I want to note in some of the questions that have been dropped, particularly in response to your presentation, but in all the presentations, people keep asking basically, specifically, what do we do? Specifically, like, how do we invest our funds? Specifically, how do we respond to this witness from history? Specifically, what to do. So there's an energy for doing. And I think this conversation might be a part of that. But I feel like what I'm hearing from you is it's less about specifics and more about an orientation, and then the specifics will emerge once we are oriented. Like we'll just, we can see what's around us and then act accordingly.
Yeah, and I just did a workshop Tuesday night with Dwight Dunstan about exactly what do we need to be doing during this time, and we were drawing from the work of Daniel Hunter, and I'll drop the article link in a moment. But under authoritarianism, there's four very specific things we need to do. We need to protect the people who are most targeted. Those of us, again, living in the United States have accesses to places of sanctuary. Many of us have homes, right? How are we protecting the people most targeted? We need to defend the parts of government that are still working and the individuals in government who are going to resist authoritarianism. We need to celebrate them. We need to support them. We need to be prepared to disobey. And we have a history and a legacy we can pull on. We have people among us who know how to do civil disobedience well. And we need to envision the alternatives that in this time of incredible chaos, violence, and crumbling that we are stepping into, the potential and rate at which we can build new alternatives is greater than it's been before. One of us is not going to do all four of those things. Some of us, when I was saying that list, was like, ooh, that's not me. I am not an in the streets person. And other of us were like, where is the spray paint? Let me get out there now. And what we need to do is work as a whole, where I say, Mary, great, you're going in the street. I'm making you dinner. I'm picking you up. I'm having care for you before and after. And if I'm a protecting people, you all are funneling resources to me and I'm telling you who to go pick up and where to take them, right? That we're working together.
Yeah.
So those lists are there. We know what we need to do. We have models. We need to stop talking and start doing.
Amen. And speaking of doing, what I'm hearing from what we've been talking about so far is a theme of community and hope, actually. The idea that being in community is itself an act of hope. That you can potentially go forward with that. With the idea of like, I'm going to commit to this group of people, even though I don't know if it's going to work out. But I'm committing to it. I'm committing to this action. But in light of that, we have to be aware of how our actions are actually, impacting those that we're trying to help. So, reflecting Lisa's principle of relationship and consent and agency by the people being helped, Stuart. Um, were there Black anti-slavery activists in the US and UK specifically that were supportive of or interested in the free produce movement? Like, how did you know the Black community in this time in this place who could respond? How did they respond?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm not sure if it came from you directly or anybody else. I dropped into the chat. I mentioned her several times. Julie Holcomb's book, Free Produce. I mean, Moral Commerce, about free produce. The book is called Moral Commerce. Really deep dive. She does a great job going through this. And one of the big takeaways from free produce we didn't even get into is that the free produce movement, again, not wildly successful by the numbers, but it was biracial, it was transatlantic, it was multi facets of the economy. Everybody was trying it. The real lack, they can say there are a couple other issues. The tools of the global economy were underdeveloped, all kinds of reasons it didn't necessarily take as well as it could. But everybody signed on. And even the fact that there's this vigorous debate happening, I mentioned Lucretia Mott's son-in-law who says, "Oh, well, we're morally superior because we want them to do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because of filthy lucre," right? But that debate was happening. It wasn't Nobody gave up on free produce at any point. It was just that there was this vigorous debate of, wow, good idea, but how? And that's exactly what could have happened. Had it been accelerated, had there been more tools available, who knows, right? But there were Black-owned free produce stores. There were, you made Frederick Douglass's actual manumission. Of course, he escaped. He liberated himself from his own enslavement. But later on, his contract, the man who had enslaved him, was actually paid for. His manumission was paid for by a British anti-slavery organization who was also engaged in free produce. And because cotton was being sent to England to be worked in all their mills in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of agitation, a lot of pushback back and forth. And different industrialists, some Quakers, some not, are really working with the free produce movement. In the United States, where there's a more sizable free Black population, they are absolutely working from Maryland on north in the free produce sector. And again, not with a lot of success necessarily commercially, but it was genuinely, they were advertising in the papers. They were the proprietors of stores often, either women running them, uh, free Black Americans are running them. A really interesting mix of people. So again, if you want to look at the details, Julie Holcomb's book has got some more examples in there. So it was a really vibrant effort, just kind of overmatched by circumstance, I think, ultimately.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm reminded of this idea that prophetic acts, are oftentimes individual and don't ripple out immediately, but wind up, embedding themselves in the culture and then over time blooming into these large trees of, these forests of resistance, I guess. Um, and I guess in that regard, speaking of that resistance, and how we resist in this moment, much of what we're going to do potentially is symbolic. So in relation to loyalty oaths, you talked about Jim, the rise and spread of loyalty oaths post World War II in relation to the rise of communism and, McCarthyism and all that other stuff. It, one of the questions was, sort of continually asking, like, what is a loyalty oath, I guess, for those who haven't encountered it, because we haven't seen it potentially for, a while. And as Quakers, we have our own, response to oaths. But yeah, if you could talk more about loyalty oaths and maybe how Quakers responded to them in that time. Were they responding as, I'm a Quaker, I don't do oaths? or are they responding as, a loyalty against the government issue? Was there sort of a general attitude that people took in relation to those? So yeah, talk on that if you have thoughts on that, Jim.
Um, well, loyalty oaths have been an issue throughout Quaker history and U.S. history. In the time of George Fox and Margaret Bell, they had to swear that they weren't loyal to the Vatican and to Catholicism. Quakers were seen initially to be secret Catholics. Um, when the U.S. War of Independence occurred, loyalty oaths were a big part of that. Quakers again mostly refused to sign or participate in them, and if they did sign loyalty oaths, their meetings often put them under discipline, even disowning them in some cases. Um, During the 1930s and 40s and 50s, loyalty oaths became more and more prevalent. Massachusetts was one of the first states to do that in 1935, affecting Henry Cadbury, who ultimately kind of signed under protest in the presentation. There's another person named Winslow who refused to sign altogether. That became a precedent for other states like Maryland and Oklahoma, California, Illinois, which all did this. Iowa, interestingly, defeated the attempt to have a loyalty oath, so it was not in every state. These oaths basically, for Quakers, they set up two standards of truth, and anyone who was disingenuous could just simply sign and say whatever. And Quakers wanted to uphold a single standard of truth. Some of those oaths were just loyalty to the U.S. government and the Constitution. Some were specifically renouncing things, attempts to overthrow it, or that they weren't a communist, or things like that. So there was a variety of forms the oaths took. Amongst the three areas that I looked at, war resistance and resistance to segregation, Quakers usually worked in those areas in combination with other groups of people. But with oaths, Quakers were often going it alone in the McCarthy period. If there was in Quakers basically defeated loyalty oaths in court. There were over 6 different Quakers who took cases all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1967, Supreme Court struck down the validity of oaths, and showed how they were, whether they were poorly worded or whether they were, I mean, just that they were unworkable. And so they haven't been as much a factor since the mid 1960s. Not that they couldn't be brought back under a new court.
Uh, yes. And I have to admit that I'm probably speaking for many people on the call when I go, this court might
And
be it.
and Welling notes that she signed one
I
uh,
no,
in
I no,
1982. Go ahead, Welling.
I'm sorry, I was trying to say, yeah, I was required to sign one when I started my PhD program at Ohio State. And that was coming out of my work. I just finished a season working with AFSC and I refused, I wouldn't do it. And because it was 1982, I don't know. I mean, I was lucky. It didn't, I'm white, lots of things. It didn't become an issue for me, but it was, I remember it being very challenging for me as a much younger person then.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that uh, maybe this is a question that is open to everyone on the panel. But I was actually talking with my spouse yesterday about sort of this feeling that we've sensed from, family and people that we know, and sort of after sort of the election, a feeling of like almost like a deflation of hope. And that's sort of a frightening thought. And I was wondering, in relation to this question of imagination and hope, each of these presentations is talking about how do we reimagine community, and how do we reimagine who is in our community and what community looks like, and how, our imaginations can shift that understanding of community. So, yeah, I was wondering, panelists, please, talk on that, from your work, from from what you're talking about, from the specific people that you're engaging with, what have you. So, yeah, however you want to answer that question, folks and me specifically would love to hear more about that.
Hope, discuss, use both sides of the page if necessary.
I've been a teacher too long.
Well, I'll jump in and say I think the sense of lack of hope is very well grounded, right? Project 2025 lays out, I've mostly just focused on the education parts, right? Reinstates the draft, but only for public school students. There's already legislation in the Senate to end the Department of Education within the next few months. There is legislation that's passed the House with Democratic support that would allow the Secretary of the Treasury to say, you five nonprofits are funding terrorists, we're revoking your 501c3 with no evidence, right? And those are just three things that we know are going to happen in the next month and a half. And so I think where we are is we're at the end of whatever paltry version of US democracy we've ever had. We're at the end game of capitalism. We're on the verge of both a civil war and World War III on multiple fronts. And so that's terrifying, right? Any one of those things is terrifying. I'm about to have an 18-year-old son in 2 years. It's terrifying. And we're people of faith, which doesn't mean we say, oh, it's going to be fine. We say we have to make it be okay. And that's where I think, to me, the hope comes from the number of people who are saying, I'm not going to comply in advance. I'm not going to comply when they ask me to, and we're going to create another reality. And the sign that I hold up, and I'm going to curse here in a moment, is when Trump issued the Muslim ban during his first term. There was this great sign that said, first they came for the Muslims, and we said, not today, motherfucker. And I think that, to me, is the attitude of hope we need to have, that we know the way we have been living is not okay. And now that many more people are going to know it's not okay. And so this is the moment to make change. And so for me, hope doesn't come from out there. It comes from all of us here on the screen going to do something differently in the coming weeks than what we have been doing. It's going to require a lot of us, but I believe we can do it. And we know there are more people that are going to be harmed by this administration in this country and globally than not. And so how do we start to build that community? If we truly believe there's that of God in everybody, means I don't have to like you and I don't have to agree with you, but I understand I'm going to work with you to create a better reality for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lisa. Thank you for naming it. And I cited early on in my presentation John O'Donohue, and I'm reminded also of one of his blessings that says, "Let the flame of your anger free you from falsity," and that one of the things that we are going to be asked to do, in line with Havel's comments in The Power of the Powerless, is we're going to be asked to embrace and endorse and adopt the lie. And I just think that one of the ways in which we can fight the alienation that living with a lie demands is to just keep speaking the truth, which may not feel hopeful in the moment, but it is a way in which we can resist the lie that we will be that there will be great pressure to adopt.
Stuart or Jim, do you want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in, and I want to pick up. I think it was from Lisa who were talking about the fact that we had no point in history how we had more tools available for nonviolent resistance than now. I think that's you. Is that right, Lisa? Yeah, because part of what I'm like my dissertation, I'll sidestep, not to polish my apple, but to tell you I'm working on learning targets, because I'm a teacher by training, Lisa. It's the same way, like I'm looking on learning targets, right? Learning targets for the resistance is yet to come, right? I have case studies from the past in order to build learning targets for how we can imagine nonviolent resistance in the future and that present. Really, we're there right now. The question I've got for folks is how come we don't have a West Point for peace building? And the more I work, the more I study, the more it seems like we do. It's just that it's kind of an archipelago of little spaces across the world, not centralized, because peace building is by its nature non-hierarchical, right? So there are more tools than ever available, but there are some basic principles that if we can share and we can help people understand, folks like us who are kind of in the academy or at least in the business of getting out there and sharing these resources of the past, we can be those points of dissemination. And like you say, then somebody else has got the kind of spray paint, somebody else is going to bring the Meals on Wheels, somebody else is going to do the sheltering. But we've never had more tools than ever before. And I really want to emphasize what friend Lisa has said about that is that the confidence I want you folks to have from my session is understand that, yeah, free produce failed. That does not mean it's a bad idea. It means you've got all these lessons to pick up from it so that next time you can, like Samuel Beckett famous says, right? His fail, try again, fail better, right? From Waiting for Godot. And that's that's exactly where we should be. Let the fire burn away your fear, right? Yeah, you might fail. That's not a reason not to try. We have more reason than ever to try. We have so many more resources than ever before. So that's again absolutely wrong. I support what folks have said. I see some other hands up, so I'll stop here.
Um, I wanted to give Jim a chance to respond, but also I was wondering, friend Steve, you've had your hand up. Is that because you have a question, and would you want to drop that in the chat instead? Let me know. Um, yeah, go ahead. No, okay, all right. If you have any questions or whatever, drop them in the chat. We will happily add those on. Um, okay, great. Thank you. Jim, do you have a response to this?
A response to what in
Uh,
particular?
the question that I asked earlier about, like, this where is our imagination and hope going to be in sort of building our community in response to what we're looking forward to, basically, in relation to what you shared.
Well, I found the essay Holy Obedience by Thomas Kelly spoke to our time as well as that past time. Um, Friends then and now are often not particularly vocal or articulate about the theology that motivates them to action. And it's a very individual thing. Um, I guess when friends think about the 1940s and 50s, we usually remember that in that period, Quakers received the Nobel Peace Prize. And we wrote a document called Speak Truth to Power. Um, but both those things were somewhat centralized within the American Friends Service Committee. And I would like to show, I mean, from my presentation, the breadth of Quaker involvement instead of a sort of the professional elite of Quakers being engaged. Um, in terms of imagination, uh, in our current moment, it's more needed than ever before, especially prophetic imagination. Um, and but Quakers have done it in the past. We're part of a long stream that continues to this moment. Um, Many of the people who I spoke about in my presentation were, some of them are still alive, but many of them only just died within the last 10 to 15 years. And so we know them. They're part of our meetings, even if in many cases we didn't know what they did as young adults. People are often quite modest about their actual activities.
Thank you. Thank you. We have we're drawing to a close. We have a few more minutes. Um, but I was wondering if there was a question that came up earlier for any of the panelists. I'm going to try and summarize it a bit here. A person said that they appreciate you not using some of the charged words or words that have become charged in the last year. Particularly, the soon-to-be president's name, or reactionaries, or Nazis, or transphobes, or what have you. And this person was really digging that. But they were wondering about this question of sort of the difference between calling out and calling in. Specifically in sort of the calling in of white people, both in sort of white spaces as well in as in BIPOC spaces. And they're wondering what your experience of, how this has occurred in your contexts in ways that were calling in, that were sort of, looking for people to sort of, engage deeper within, as opposed to sort of, calling out in that sort of you're canceling kind of way. So yeah, any of the panelists have thoughts on that?
That's what I wrote my master's thesis on, so I'll jump in there. I'll say that to me, I always want to ask, what am I up to? Right? Sometimes I need to call out because a boundary needs to be set and something's not okay in the moment and a firm line needs to be drawn. What I think of as calling in is understanding I hear you making a mistake I myself have made, and I'm not separating myself from you in that, but want to be with you in that. Or I hear you making a mistake I'm about to make or do a harm I'm about to do. And so it's a being with. There are many words I got taught growing up in my very loving, well-intentioned household that were based on racial slurs or slurs against ethnic groups because we didn't know the origin of those words, right? I think of that as a very low level calling in. I have information you don't have. Let me share it with you. And then I think of the higher level of the way I see you moving right now is causing a lot of harm. And I actually want to be with you in that so that we can stop harm together. I don't think cancel culture serves anybody. I think there are times when boundaries need to get set, and that I think it's a spectrum and a continuum. And too often, I can watch other white people fall into like, oh, but my feelings are hurt. So that's a call out. You didn't do it right. And it's not about doing it right. It's about what are we up to and how do we move to a place of less harm and less white supremacy.
Amen. And again, any of the other panelists want to respond? We have about 2 minutes left.
I really want to commend the Havel essay to folks, even though it's decades old and was writing to a different culture, because I feel like it speaks so strongly to the moment today. And on the question of calling out versus calling in, one of the things that he talks about is how this line of alienation goes right through people, and he operates from the assumption that a lot of people most of the time are doing the very best they can with the resources that they have available to them. And I like Lisa's comment about calling in being a way basically to, or I am interpreting it as a way to give resources to people who are resourceless to deal with the alienation that they are currently experiencing.
All right. I think we're coming to our time. So if there's something that Jim or Stuart you want to squeeze in there, last response.
Keep it up. When you know better, do better.
I look in the chat for a presentation that I'm giving with Brian Blackmore in February on queer Quaker resistance from 1924 to 2024.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. And what we're going to try to do is, every year we're successful at getting this recording up on YouTube, and it'll be on YouTube probably within the next hour or two, as long as it takes time to have YouTube chug through it and actually upload it. Tomorrow at this same time, 11 to 1 Eastern, and then wherever you are, adjust that accordingly. We will be having our next sessions, and we'll be listening to Pam Haynes, Mary Watkins, who's on the call today. Hi, Mary. Lena Blunt and Cherise Harrison Nelson, St. Clair Almond, both accompanied by Nathan Schroyer. And those look to be absolutely dope and amazing. We're going to go ahead and have that one recorded and posted by tomorrow afternoon as well. And the challenge we have with trying to get the transcripts of the chats, and there's so much richness there, is just finding exactly where we're going to put that. We might have to put it on our QTDG website, but we'll let you know about that in the future. Everyone who is here is going to get an email later today with a link to the this recording. If you desperately want to go back and watch us again, that would be awesome. And I guess with that, I want to say thank you all so much for coming today. This community that we have here, everything we do is volunteer led. There is no money that is passed by anyone whatsoever. Teresa and I have never gotten a dime from this. So all of this is sort of it's this work of love and a gift to the community. And I'm really glad that y'all are joining in and participating and giving us your time and your effort. Thank you so very much. Tomorrow, Charisse is going to be the leader. I'm going to be in the back, and we will see you then. Have a lovely day, everyone.